The scream that tore through the school lab that afternoon was unlike anything I had ever heard, high, sharp, and raw enough to cut straight through the cheerful chatter of the science fair preparations and drive me running down the hallway before I even knew I'd moved. The heavy door banged open to chaos. Shattered beakers glittered like broken ice across the tile floor, the acrid scent of chemicals burned my nose, and in the center of it all my daughter Emma lay slumped against a lab table, her white uniform shirt blooming scarlet under a spreading stain of blood. Beside her stood Karen, the HOA board member who had been harassing our school for months over petty complaints, her face twisted with a wild, unrecognizable rage and a bloodied kitchen knife trembling in her grip. For a breathless second, the world narrowed to the glint of that blade and the terror in Emma's eyes as she clutched her side. My heart slammed so hard I felt it in my throat, but training and pure parental instinct surged through me. I lunged forward, shoving a rolling cart to block Karen's next move while shouting for help. Children screamed and scattered, a flask exploded with a hiss of steam, the fire alarm shrieked overhead. Somewhere far off, I heard the first wail of approaching sirens, but all I could focus on was Emma's weakening voice and the crimson pooling beneath her. Karen's grip tightened, and she stepped closer, eyes locked on me. I had only seconds to decide how to stop her, and no idea how far she was willing to go. The weeks before the incident now feel like a perfect dream, a time wrapped in gentle light where every detail of daily life seemed to fit together with effortless grace, and I held it all close without realizing how fragile it truly was. Each morning began with the soft clang of the school bell echoing across the courtyard of Willow Creek Academy, where I had proudly served as principal for nearly 10 years, and I loved the smell of freshly sharpened pencils mixed with the rich aroma of coffee wafting from the teacher's lounge. My 13-year-old daughter Emma, bright and endlessly curious, was thriving, her latest science project on coral reef ecosystem spread across our dining table like a treasure map of colors and possibilities. We shared a cheerful little house only a short drive from campus, with a garden Emma had filled with seashells from our beach trips and a hammock that swayed lazily beneath old oak trees. The mornings we spent there were a ritual of warmth and routine. I brewed coffee while she toasted bagels and sketched ocean creatures in her notebook, our conversations ranging from which student club might host the next fundraiser to the latest fascinating fact she had discovered about whale migration. After breakfast, we would drive to school together, sometimes singing along to our favorite playlists, sometimes riding in a comfortable silence that needed no words. My workdays were busy but deeply fulfilling, meetings with teachers, welcoming parents, visiting classrooms to see the spark of understanding in students' eyes, but there was always a special joy in knowing that Emma was just a hallway away, often in the science lab with her closest friends, laughing over experiments or testing theories with a focus that made me proud. She loved staying after the final bell, and I often lingered with her, finishing paperwork while the soft hum of Bunsen burners and the gentle murmur of her laughter drifted through the quiet halls, a soundtrack of safety and promise. Evenings were our sanctuary. Sometimes we cooked side by side, with her taking charge of garlic butter pasta while I chopped vegetables, or we curled up on the couch to watch ocean documentaries, marveling at jellyfish that glowed like living lanterns. Weekends brimmed with simple pleasures, Saturday farmers markets where Emma insisted on sampling every homemade jam, Sunday hikes where we counted hawks and traded stories about the future, and quiet evenings reading under the warm glow of the living room lamp. My colleagues often told me they admired how I balanced my demanding role with motherhood, and I felt blessed to belong to a school community that felt more like an extended family than a workplace. Parents trusted me, teachers respected me, and students ran to greet me in the halls, their laughter a daily gift. Life felt steady, almost invincible, as if the rhythm of love, learning, and quiet joy could stretch on forever. I remember standing by my office window one breezy spring afternoon, watching daffodils sway under a pale blue sky, and thinking with a heart full of gratitude that this was the best season of our lives, that Emma's teenage years would bloom safely within these walls and that our bond would only deepen as she grew. Yet even as I breathed in that contentment, somewhere unseen, a storm was gathering. Unknown to me, resentment and cruelty were already taking root in a neighbor's mind, and the very science lab where Emma's laughter rang like music would soon be transformed into the scene of a nightmare. There were no tremors in the air, no ominous hints sharp enough to pierce the comfort of our routines, only the soft murmur of ordinary days that seemed endless and indestructible. In retrospect, those weeks glow in memory like a fragile glass sphere, beautiful, perfect, and impossibly delicate, seconds away from the shattering blow that would change everything. At first, the trouble with Karen unfolded like faint static at the edge of an otherwise perfect melody, small irritations that seemed almost laughable, the kind of neighborly friction every school leader deals with from time to time, but as the days passed those harmless ripples hardened into something darker and more deliberate, a tension that hummed beneath every interaction until it felt as if the very air around Willow Creek Academy carried a charge. It began innocently enough with emails laced in saccharine politeness, a complaint about the unnecessary brightness of the school's evening security lights, a grievance over children's laughter drifting past her fence during recess, and even a suggestion that our community garden be removed because the smell of soil and compost is hardly suitable for a residential neighborhood of our caliber. I treated them as routine civic feedback, replying with calm explanations and gentle reassurances, believing that transparency and kindness would smooth the edges of her discontent. But Karen's tone sharpened quickly. When her next letter arrived, slid beneath my office door late one evening, the carefully chosen words barely disguised contempt. If the principal cannot maintain a proper standard of order, perhaps the board will need to re-evaluate leadership. Around the same time, teachers began to mention a strange visitor lingering by the playground after dismissal, a woman in oversized sunglasses who watched the children with a clenched jaw and occasionally snapped photos on her phone. Though no one had yet linked this behavior to Karen, a quiet unease began to thread its way through the faculty lounge conversations. Then came the incidents too precise to be coincidence. A row of flowers Emma and her classmates planted was ripped up overnight, the locks to the science lab mysteriously jammed with glue, and a series of anonymous social media posts accusing the school of harboring unsafe practices that could endanger children. Each new act felt calculated to rattle us, but still I told myself it was an overzealous neighbor, nothing more, and urged staff to stay professional. Emma, ever perceptive, sensed the shift long before I admitted it to myself. One evening as we washed dishes, she told me she'd seen Karen watching from the edge of the parking lot, her eyes cold and unblinking. "She doesn't like me, Mom," she whispered, her usual spark dulled by unease. I wrapped her in a hug and promised her she was safe, that adults would handle it, but the promise rang thin even to my own ears. Soon Karen escalated her tactics from whispers to open confrontation. She interrupted a parent-teacher meeting to berate a science instructor about reckless chemical experiments, her voice so sharp it silenced the room. Days later, a notice arrived from the HOA demanding that all after-school lab activities cease until a safety review was completed, an order with no legal standing but enough to sow confusion and delay Emma's beloved projects. When I reached out to mediate, Karen met me at her door with a cold smile and words that clung to me like frost. "Principal or not, you don't get to decide how this neighborhood is run." "I do." Her eyes, hard and unblinking, told me she meant every word. From that moment the air between us grew electric, charged with something far beyond a zoning dispute, and I found myself double-checking the locks each night, scanning the parking lot before stepping outside, and keeping my phone within reach even during meetings. What unsettled me most was her eerie fixation on Emma. Notes began to appear in Emma's locker, brief, chilling messages like, "Children should stay home after dark," or "Science isn't safe for little girls," unsigned but written in the same angular script as the earlier letters. I brought these to the attention of local authorities, who logged the reports but admitted they had little to pursue without a direct threat. The inadequacy of their response gnawed at me. Meanwhile, Karen grew bolder. She began showing up uninvited during evening lab sessions, standing in doorways with arms folded as she scrutinized every move Emma and her friends made, her presence a silent challenge that frayed the edges of our once cheerful space. One night, after everyone else had gone home, I caught sight of her through my office window, crouched near the back entrance with something metallic in her hand. By the time I reached the door she had vanished into the shadows, leaving only a faint metallic smell and a deepening certainty that this was no longer a series of petty grievances. I remember driving home that night under a bruised purple sky, every street lamp a reminder of how quickly light can be swallowed by darkness, and realizing with a heavy knot in my chest that Karen's anger had slipped beyond the reach of reason. The first sparks of war had been struck, and while I still clung to the hope that dialogue or legal measures might douse the flames, some instinct deeper than thought warned me that the storm gathering around us would not be settled by words alone. The night of the attack began with a quiet that felt almost enchanted, the sort of stillness that makes every tiny sound ring louder, as if the building itself were holding its breath, and as I locked my office and stepped into the empty hallway, I noticed how the polished floors reflected the faint moonlight filtering through tall windows, a silver sheen that turned the familiar corridors of Willow Creek Academy into a dreamlike maze of shadows and echoes. It was nearly 9 o'clock, well after most students and teachers had left, but Emma and a few science club friends were finishing a final round of experiments for the upcoming fair, and their soft laughter drifted faintly from the distant lab like a beacon of joy in the hushed school. I was halfway down the corridor when the air shifted, a faint metallic clank from somewhere beyond the science wing, subtle but wrong enough to quicken my heart. I paused, listening. The hallway clock ticked, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzed, and then, unmistakably, the low creak of the side door opening where no one should have been. I quickened my pace, my shoes whispering against the linoleum, every sense sharpening as if the night itself were warning me to hurry. As I neared the lab, the lights above flickered and a chill rippled through me. The sound of Emma's laughter had vanished, replaced by a tense silence broken only by the thud of hurried footsteps and the crash of something heavy hitting the floor. I shoved the lab door open and was met with a scene that froze me mid-breath. Stools overturned, glass beakers shattered across the counter, a faint chemical smell burning the air, and in the center of it all stood Karen, her eyes wild and unrecognizable, one hand clutching a gleaming metal object that caught the dim light like a threat. Emma and her friends stood pressed against the far wall, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. "Nobody move," Karen barked, her voice sharp as a snapped wire, the words ricocheting around the tiled room. Time seemed to splinter, my mind raced through every emergency drill I'd ever overseen, every training session about intruders and crisis response. Without breaking eye contact, I reached behind me and hit the emergency alarm panel. Within seconds a shrill siren wailed through the school, red lights flashing along the hallway outside like frantic heartbeats. The sudden noise startled Karen, and that instant of hesitation gave me just enough space to move closer, my voice steady but urgent as I told Emma and her friends to duck behind the heavy demonstration table. Karen's words tumbled out in a bitter flood, accusations about dangerous chemicals, disrespectful children, and a school poisoning the neighborhood, her grievances twisting into something fierce and irrational as she advanced. I stepped between her and the students, heart hammering but posture unyielding, speaking low and firm, trying to draw her focus away from Emma while inching toward the nearest phone on the counter. Outside the door came the distant pounding of running footsteps, teachers and late-working staff responding to the alarm, and through the shriek of sirens I heard the far-off wail of approaching police units. But inside the room, the world narrowed to a breath-by-breath standoff, Karen's ragged breathing, the harsh hum of the fume hood, Emma's soft sobs muffled beneath the counter. When Karen lunged a half-step forward, I seized the moment, sweeping a rolling lab cart into her path. It clattered across the floor and struck her shin, throwing her off balance just as 2 security officers burst in from the hall. The struggle that followed blurred into a whirlwind of motion and sound, commands shouted, chairs knocked aside, the screech of rubber soles on tile, until at last the officers secured Karen and wrestled the metal object from her grasp. The room fell into a stunned silence broken only by Emma's sudden, piercing cry of relief as she ran into my arms. I held her tight, feeling her heartbeat race against mine, and for a long moment the rest of the world, sirens, flashing lights, murmuring staff, faded into nothing. When the police arrived moments later, their radios crackling with urgent codes, they swept through with professional precision, gathering statements, photographing the chaos of broken glass and chemical spills, and finally escorting Karen away in handcuffs, her furious shouts echoing down the corridor like a storm finally breaking. Even as calm began to seep back into the room, I couldn't shake the electric tension still buzzing in my veins or the raw understanding of how close we had come to tragedy. Emma clung to me, trembling, and I promised her in a fierce whisper that she was safe and would never face this terror alone again. Outside, red and blue lights painted the night in flashing streaks as neighbors gathered in stunned disbelief, their whispers carrying a single, inescapable truth: our peaceful world had been shattered, and though the immediate danger was over, nothing about our lives, or the school I had dedicated my heart to, would ever be quite the same. The hours after the attack unfolded in a haze of sirens, harsh fluorescent lights, and a disbelief so heavy it seemed to press the air from my chest, and even now that night feels like a single unbroken moment of shock stretched across days. I stayed with Emma while paramedics checked her vitals and wrapped a blanket around her trembling shoulders, their calm, professional voices cutting through the chaos with instructions I could barely absorb, and though she was physically unharmed, the terror in her eyes told me how close we had come to catastrophe. The science lab remained a shattered tableau behind us, cordoned off with yellow tape while officers photographed every shard of glass and chemical spill, and yet even as police collected evidence and security officers replayed the alarm footage, I sensed that the real battle had only begun. At the hospital later that night, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic beep of monitors should have been comforting, but my heart thudded with a raw mix of relief and fury: relief that Emma was alive and safe, fury that anyone could bring such violence into a place meant for learning and trust. As Emma finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, I stepped into the hallway where detectives waited with notepads and clipped questions, their eyes betraying the same quiet outrage I felt. They confirmed what I already knew: the woman in custody was Karen, the HOA board member who had for months waged a campaign of petty harassment against our school. Yet what I didn't expect was how quickly Karen's story twisted the truth. By morning, news outlets were buzzing with her version: a wild tale of defending herself from supposed chemical hazards and acting to protect neighborhood children. She claimed she had entered the lab only after hearing screams of an explosion, painting herself as a reluctant hero rather than the aggressor. To my astonishment, her attorney echoed these claims in early press statements, hinting that Karen had been provoked by administrative negligence. I listened to those words on the hospital's small television and felt the floor tilt beneath me. Parents I had known for years called and texted in confusion, some frightened, some angry, all desperate for clarity, and though most believed in my account, a few wavered when confronted with Karen's polished lies. Back at the school, teachers described reporters camping outside the gates and social media feeds filling with speculation, half-truths, and wild rumors. Worse still, the HOA leadership released a carefully worded statement urging calm while conspicuously avoiding any condemnation of Karen's actions, as if property values were their chief concern rather than the trauma inflicted on children. It was an injustice so bitter it burned, but I forced myself to stay measured, answering every investigator's question with precise detail, sharing security footage, signed visitor logs, every email and threatening note Karen had sent. Still, the legal process moved at a glacial pace that felt cruelly detached from the urgency of what we'd survived. Emma struggled too. She startled at sudden noises and hesitated before walking into the lab she once loved, her confidence shaken in ways I couldn't soothe with simple reassurances. Yet amid the anger and fear, a fierce resolve took root in me. I organized a meeting with parents and staff in the school auditorium, where I stood beneath the harsh stage lights and recounted the events of that night in calm, unwavering detail. The room was silent as I described how Karen had stalked the campus, how she had cornered our children, how she had lied. When I finished, an older teacher rose and simply said, "We stand with you," and a wave of quiet affirmation followed. It was a small victory, but it mattered. In the weeks that followed, I attended every court hearing, refusing to let Karen's narrative stand unchallenged. Each time I faced her across the courtroom, her cold, unrepentant gaze met mine, but I held it without flinching, driven by the knowledge that our community's safety, and Emma's healing, depended on the truth prevailing. Though the legal battle stretched on, each step forward, each parent's letter of support, each child's return to laughter felt like reclaiming ground she had tried to steal. Yet the sense of injustice lingered like a shadow, that someone could bring terror into a school, twist the truth into a public spectacle, and force an entire community to defend the obvious, that children deserve to be safe and believed. That night changed everything, not only in the fractured quiet of our home but in the way I understood resilience. We were hurt, but we were unbroken, and as I watched Emma walk back into her beloved lab weeks later, shoulders squared and chin high, I knew that no lie, no courtroom delay, and no act of malice could erase the strength we had forged in the crucible of that dark, unjust night. The turning point came the morning after one of Karen's preliminary hearings, when I sat in my office surrounded by manila folders of witness statements, printed emails, and security camera stills and realized that waiting for the legal system to move at its own sluggish pace was no longer enough. I needed to take control of the narrative and fortify every angle of proof so thoroughly that no lawyer or HOA board spin could erode it. I began by assembling a quiet alliance of people who had witnessed Karen's harassment long before the night of the attack, teachers who had received her threatening letters, parents who had seen her loitering by the playground, and even a delivery driver who once caught her trying to force the school side gate. Over strong coffee in the staff room after hours, we reviewed every shred of communication she had sent, emails full of veiled threats, unsigned locker notes in the same sharp handwriting, and the HOA's own meeting minutes that documented her obsession with shutting down the science lab. At the same time, I coordinated with local authorities to secure high-resolution copies of the school's security footage, ensuring not only the night of video but also weeks of prior clips showing her lurking near entrances and tampering with locks. With the help of a tech-savvy parent who volunteered his expertise, we cross-referenced time-stamps, matched the handwriting samples to her earlier letters, and created a clear timeline that wove every minor disturbance into a single undeniable pattern of intent. Knowing that public pressure can accelerate justice, I quietly reached out to a trusted journalist known for meticulous reporting on community safety issues. Over several careful meetings, I provided documented facts and access to sources who could speak on record, making certain the story emphasized not only the attack itself but also the long trail of warnings that authorities had initially underestimated. The article that followed was a masterstroke, balanced yet devastating. It dismantled Karen's claims of self-defense and showed her months-long campaign of intimidation as a calculated prelude to violence. Simultaneously, I fortified internal safeguards at the school. With board approval, we installed additional high-definition cameras at every entrance and introduced a new ID scan system for after-hours access. I even worked with a retired law enforcement friend to conduct staff training sessions on de-escalation and emergency response, both to protect our community and to demonstrate to the court and the public that our school valued proactive safety measures. Each step served a dual purpose: genuine protection and airtight evidence that the institution under my care was responsible, transparent, and beyond reproach. In the courtroom, these preparations began to tell. When Karen's defense tried to paint her as a concerned neighbor acting on impulse, we produced dated emails in her own words demanding the shutdown of the lab and threatening to take matters into my own hands. When they questioned the reliability of eyewitnesses, we presented synchronized footage showing her near the science wing on nights she had claimed to be elsewhere. Perhaps most powerfully, parents and students she had once intimidated now felt emboldened to testify, their accounts weaving a tapestry of truth that no counterargument could unravel. Outside the courthouse, the tide of public opinion shifted decisively. Community members who had once reserved judgment began to organize vigils and write letters of support, their voices amplifying the call for justice until it could not be ignored. Through it all, I maintained a calm exterior, never allowing Karen's cold stares or her lawyer's sharp insinuations to rattle me, because I knew the trap we had built was not of vengeance but of clarity, every fact checked, every timeline verified, every action driven by a simple, unassailable purpose: to protect our children and ensure that the violence Karen brought to our doorstep could never be repeated. By the time the final hearing approached, the outcome felt less like a question than a confirmation of what the evidence already proved, and as I sat beside Emma in the crowded courtroom, her small hand gripping mine, I understood that we had turned fear into strategy, strategy into action, and action into a wall of truth strong enough to hold back even the most determined lies. The courthouse was packed to the rafters on the crisp morning of Karen's sentencing, every seat filled with parents, teachers, and neighbors who had watched the long ordeal unfold and now wanted to witness its conclusion. The air inside was charged, a mixture of quiet fury and long-awaited relief, and as the judge entered, a hush fell so complete that the scrape of his chair echoed like thunder. Months of painstaking evidence, emails, surveillance footage, witness statements, and the powerful news investigation had left little room for argument. Karen sat rigid at the defense table, her once manicured appearance frayed, eyes darting as if still searching for an escape route that no longer existed. When the judge began reading the verdict, each word felt like a stone dropping into a still pond, final and irreversible, guilty on multiple counts including unlawful entry, attempted assault with a weapon, and harassment of a minor. The gasp that rippled through the room was followed by an almost palpable exhale of collective justice. The prosecutor outlined the recommended sentence, underscoring the months of deliberate intimidation and the sheer recklessness of her late-night intrusion, and the judge, his voice measured but unyielding, delivered a ruling that ensured she would face significant prison time along with a lifetime restraining order from every school in the district. As deputies moved to escort her away, Karen's defiance crumbled. She tried to speak, but only a choked whisper escaped. Cameras flashed like lightning as reporters captured the moment she was led through the gallery, shackles clinking softly, her face a portrait of disbelief and public humiliation. For me and Emma, standing together as the community applauded quietly out of respect for the solemn setting, the moment was more than legal victory, it was a reclaiming of safety and dignity that Karen had tried so hard to destroy. Outside the courthouse, neighbors embraced, teachers shed tears of relief, and parents thanked us for standing firm when fear and lies threatened to rewrite reality. I held Emma close as she lifted her chin toward the spring sunlight, her eyes bright with a strength beyond her years. In that instant, I knew the long nightmare had ended and that the truth, painstakingly built and bravely defended, had not only defeated Karen's malice but transformed it into a lesson the entire community would remember: no amount of intimidation can outlast the steady, unshakable force of justice. Spring sunlight poured across Willow Creek Academy the morning after Karen's sentencing, glinting on the windows and washing the hallways in warmth that felt almost ceremonial, as if the building itself were exhaling after a long, sleepless winter. Emma walked beside me through the freshly polished corridors, her backpack swinging lightly, and for the first time in months her laughter rang without the tremor of fear. Teachers paused to wave, parents stopped to thank us, and the once anxious school now hummed again with the easy rhythm of learning and life. The lab, once a scene of chaos, had been scrubbed clean and refitted with stronger security and brighter lights, and when Emma and her friends set up their new experiments that afternoon, their excitement carried a defiant joy, proof that knowledge and curiosity will always outshine the shadows of intimidation. Outside our walls, the story had spread far beyond our town. News outlets highlighted the power of a community united by truth, and messages of support flooded my inbox from parents, educators, and students across the country who found strength in our refusal to be silenced. Standing on the school's front steps as the day wound down, I felt a quiet gratitude and a sharpened purpose, because what began as one family's ordeal had become a reminder that vigilance, courage, and collective action can turn fear into a force for change. If our journey has moved you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more real stories of resilience, and help keep this conversation alive. The night Karen tried to break us became the day our community discovered its unshakable core, and as Emma leaned against me and whispered, "We're safe now, Mom," I knew those words would echo long after the headlines faded, a lasting testament to the truth that even the darkest night can end in light.